So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces. We talk with founders and leaders on some of today's top marketplaces. So this is episode 50, and I'm actually going back and reshooting the intro for the group chat that we had this morning with Marc McCabe, who's previously at SV Angel and Airbnb. This is a really great chat that we had with Marc, where he shares more on his experience with marketplaces, fundraising, and then now more on working with startup founders on fundraising specifically. So you're really going to enjoy this group chat that we had, and then some of the great questions towards the end for those that were on the chat during the Q&A. But I'm just going to cut right to the intro with Marc sharing a little bit more on his background and then what led him to joining SV Angel and Airbnb.
Sure thing. So thanks very much for having me first, Mike, and very nice to see all your faces. I've been investing and operating around tech for about 15 years. Initially first in Dublin, my first gig was at Google. And then I was lucky enough to make my way over to the Bay Area in 2010. I was working for a seed stage fund then called SV Angel, as you mentioned. So started by Ron Conway. Very high pace of investing. I probably talked to something like 1,500 startups over a year and a half. But the one that stood out in my mind most was a young Brian Chesky that I met in August of 2010. And I think at the time, like most VCs were still pretty skeptical of Airbnb. Like none of them were going to stay in someone else's house, that's for sure. They were going to stay in the Peninsula or the Four Seasons or wherever they were going. But I had been in the Bay Area for like 3 months. I couldn't get a lease on an apartment because I have no credit history. And I've done a lot of like backpacking on my own as well. So I just think Brian is like doing the most incredible thing I've ever heard of. And he's giving us this update that's sort of like, we think this might be working. We might do 2 million in revenue this year. And, I stayed very close to the company. And I'd only been obviously in the seed investing job for a few months, but I sort of had already decided in my mind someday, somehow I was going to go work with these guys. They just were so excited, so much energy. There was just a different vibe to their office, to, the hundreds of other startups that I was visiting over that year. And at the end of 2011, I hear they're going to hire their first business development manager. And I sort of jumped at it. I go through like a 4-month interview process where I'm meeting increasingly tired looking people and they're like just coming out of their Series B raise at the time, and things are really escalating. You have this company called Wimdu in Europe, which was an Airbnb clone started by this Rocket Internet group and the Samware brothers, and they've just raised a war chest and kind of publicly declared they're going to come after Airbnb. So is it, a tough time in the company's history. They'd also just had what we called internally the EJ case, where we had our first really public trashing of an apartment in the Bay Area. And so that's sort of the context when I joined, right at the very end of 2011. And so I think my first day on the job, I meet with our head of product, Joe, who I know Mike has met before. And Joe's a lovely guy. We're very good friends. But that first day, I'll never forget. He kind of looks me in the eyes and say, "Hey, BD guy, we have 15 engineers. The site was down for 2 hours yesterday. If you think you're building like an API team or anything that requires dev resources, it's not happening. Welcome aboard. Nice to meet you." And so my first couple of years, I kind of set myself around, where could I find problems that, I could operate on, that were aligned with what the company was trying to do. And payments was sort of the first of those. So I spent my first year really just working on payments. And I can definitely talk in a little bit more detail about that. My sort of second year at Airbnb was I started their first non-core vertical, which was Airbnb for Business. Started at a hackathon after reading this design research report that was circulated internally. And we won the hackathon, and it kind of gave me some air cover to work on it for a few months, and did some good stuff during those months. And so I was able to build a team and ended up being like a 40-person team, doing a pretty significant chunk of Airbnb's bookings, or like a growing portion of our bookings were actually going to business travelers, which is maybe the wildest thing about it. And then my last couple of years, Joe Gebbia, one of the other co-founders, had seen what I was doing and had asked, hey, listen, do you want to, you seem like a 0 to 1 guy. Like, do you want to keep spinning up new things? And I've just started this R&D group. Come help me with it. And it's kind of, it was a bit too tempting, and so I jumped at it, and I basically went from hiring like enterprise salespeople to remote mechanical engineers in Moscow, and trying to buy like $30,000 worth of steel with a credit card. And so that was like my 7 years at Airbnb. And since then, I've started microfunds. I had a consultancy business where I helped founders raise capital at Series A and B. And I'm not very polemic, but I did like a little bit of content around that. And at the end of 2019, I moved back with my wife and 2 kids to Ireland, just before the pandemic came in, which was amazing timing, I guess. And it kind of changed my perspective. I think we're in a much more global landscape than we were in 18 months ago. And much the way some startups have sort of taken remote first approach, I'm now starting to do this with VC, where I'm actually raising a fund at the moment, to continue investing in seed stage companies, but with a pretty global outlook on it. So that's me.
That's awesome, and that's quite the incredible experience. So yeah, so I definitely want to jump into a little bit more, about kind of Airbnb and your time there, and then segue into investing or fundraising a little bit. But before
Sure.
we do, maybe could you just share, what is kind of your interest, or what led to your interest in marketplaces specifically as kind of businesses?
Yeah, I don't even know if it started out as an interest in marketplaces. And if anything, if you've worked in one for a considerable period of time, you might be thinking, I'm like, never want to work on marketplaces ever again. Except for like once they start working. And I think, what I love about marketplaces is there's sort of like a feng shui thing to them. When they do work, you really feel like they're this accretive business model that makes something that was kind of impossible happen. Whereas, like, a lot of startups that I might look at seed stage that I'm investing in, they might be improving internal processes, which is a strong area like I like to invest in a lot. They might be making that 3x faster, or making a fairly big step change in how things are done internally. But there's something about a marketplace where not only can it like make a huge amount of commerce that wasn't previously possible, but also create opportunities for such a large group of individuals as well. Whether you're talking about the demand side of Fair, or obviously the host side of Airbnb, the supply side of Uber. Like, I just think what we've really seen is not like capturing economic activity that was already happening, but actually creating entirely new sources of economic activity. And maybe that's probably what ultimately inspires me the most about marketplaces. And also, it's just crazy when they actually work. That's maybe the wildest thing about them.
Yeah, certainly. And on that note too, kind of working with marketplaces now, and maybe even on the investing side, how do you evaluate marketplaces?
Oh, that's going to be a long answer. There's a few different things that I look at, but it's obviously there. I was watching the Oscars last night, and David Fincher said there's 100 ways to make a scene, but only 2 of them are good, or something along those lines. I'm probably paraphrasing him wrong. But I actually think, and that's probably how I saw marketplaces at the very start. But over time, I've come to see so many different models of how they initiate go to market, how they've gotten off the ground, and what those signals might look like, that I'm kind of more just referring to a pattern of signals that I've seen over the years. A few things that I guess I look for. One, I think, is unique supply. If you are really starting a marketplace and you've already shown the ability to bring supply on board that didn't exist anywhere else, I find that quite fascinating. And there's a different set of questions that might like lead from finding out that data point. Obviously a very fragmented market, that's kind of a bit more table stakes. You want to see something that has been very difficult to complete previously, and why the marketplace might bring that together. A signal that maybe you don't hear a lot about, but it's especially important for investors, is why now. and you'll hear investors talk about this with every startup pitch, but for marketplaces, it's really, really important because there's nothing necessarily technologically innovative about the software behind a marketplace most of the time. There has been historically, but I think today to connect a buyer and seller over an online marketplace, you're reusing a lot of things that have been built over the last 10 years. And so there has to be this kind of assessment of like why this hasn't really existed previously. I think, especially if they're starting as a listing service rather than like a full marketplace to start, I'm looking for a certain amount of liquidity and engagement specifically on one side of the marketplace. And then I think, especially if it's a first iteration and it's probably pretty clunky or not the exact ideal experience that you'd want to see, engagement is really important. Whether as a demand side participant, you keep coming back even though you're not converting. So like high engagement despite low conversion rate, I think is really interesting signal. Or on the supply side, whether you're just seeing an abundance of interest on the supply side, I think those are probably the most interesting signals I've seen.
That's great. That's super helpful. So I did want to ask, marketplaces are incredibly complex. And so maybe what are some of the kind of unique challenges that are in the earlier stages, say, seed round or seed stage kind of marketplaces that are looking to raise a Series A? What are some of the kind of challenges that might be unique to marketplaces as they're approaching a raise?
I don't know if there's anything particularly unique as it comes into fundraising, except for the fact that obviously with marketplaces, you have some dynamics that make them harder to start. If I'm building a SaaS tools company, it's about addressing pain points, selling directly, and managing your growth to a point where you can kind of craft almost a growth trajectory that's going to satisfy investors. And not to make light of that or say that it's very easy, but there's almost established benchmarks, right? Like investors, especially at seed or Series A, are looking for 15%, month over month growth. I think with marketplaces, it's more dynamic and it's difficult to show traction early on, especially. So I think the cold start challenge is probably the biggest thing that makes it hard to raise capital. Like, can you show enough? And are your maybe more intangible signals interesting enough that you can swat away the more stable benchmarking that investors are going to see in other sectors? I even think in some ways it's harder than some of the deep R&D stuff. Like when you're looking at, say, space or like heavy R&D bio, you almost don't need traction. If anything, traction is more in the form of a workflow that you can really control a lot of the time. Whereas with marketplaces, I think there's not this perfect recipe. There's not like a clear path all the time. And so being able to kind of rub two sticks together and make that first spark just takes a little bit longer and is harder to explain compared to some of these kind of higher R&D areas.
I think that's definitely great. So on that note too, you were mentioning kind of some of the signals. So maybe what are some of those that you kind of look for?
Yeah, well, I probably covered. I actually wrote down a few because I figured this was going to come up.
Yeah.
I think like the signal that I always find maybe the most interesting is around creating this new economic activity that I was referring to earlier. So in the case of Airbnb and Uber, what makes them so interesting is, especially Uber actually, just looking at that, there was already a pretty large, if you want to call it, marketplace or certainly supply side of drivers who were taking money to drive people around the town. And yet I think if you talked to residents in, say, San Francisco or even New York, which had like a really obviously fairly established taxi market, you would find them thinking that experience was pretty poor, especially around like 2010, 2011, just before Uber really breaks in. And I think what was most interesting is that, Uber started with a small wedge of private car supply that like wasn't really able to access the same market as taxis. And very quickly over time you could see people who hadn't been taxi drivers before gravitating towards the supply side of Uber. And that is like a really fascinating signal. It kind of means that the economic interests are really well aligned. It also says that there's a pretty decent amount of liquidity in the market if new people are willing to take a huge risk to do something that they weren't previously doing. And most likely they've heard this from another person who's been using it, has been getting what they want out of the platform enough to go tell this person who's never been a driver that, hey, you should consider this is an effective way to make money. So when you see new supply coming on board, and I really mean like it hasn't been involved in any legacy activity that you might compare to this new marketplace, that's a phenomenal signal. I can give you a couple of other examples that are like that. There's two other marketplaces that I'll call out that I think are really interesting that I've invested in. One is Chef. One of the first investors in their seed round when they were coming out of Y Combinator. And actually in that same, it was the batch just beforehand, the YC batch just before I invested in Papa. And in both of these cases, you could see that they were going to be attacking a form of supply that like had no economic representation in the markets that these businesses were operating in. And sorry, I should probably explain what those two startups are for those who haven't come across them before. Chef is essentially a marketplace for, I guess you could call it like an Airbnb for cloud kitchens. It allows individuals to spin up their own cloud kitchens, and then Chef will take the food from those folks who are making it, preparing it in their own, sometimes like their own home or apartment. Though some of them have started to scale up and set up their own production facilities as well, and they will deliver it much like Postmates or DoorDash to someone's home. And I find it really interesting. They started initially with like expat communities in the South Bay, and what they had noticed was that in a lot of these like expat communities, especially in multifamily housing, you will find that there's one person in the building who often ends up taking on the burden of making food for a number of other people in the building. So they will literally like ask people in the morning, like, who wants dinner tonight? Prepare like a large meal that they can split up and divvy up into portions, and then people will come down to that apartment to pick up their food. And they'd seen this happening. And another interesting signal they'd seen happening was around legislation changing in California about health requirements for food production facilities, so that individuals could really start to prepare food in their home and avoid some of the challenges that had happened. This business idea was not like totally new. There'd certainly been no successful company that was doing it, but there'd been a couple of attempts in New York, sort of in the mid naughty, or I guess it was like 2012, 2013. We saw a couple of startups pop up around New York where they were doing dinner clubs, and a chef would like host you in their home and prepare dinner for a small group. So we'd seen some of this activity happening before, but this new legislation in California seemed like a really pivotal point. And the final signal I saw from Chef was a kind of love for what the supply side was doing that I found really exciting. So there was, they'd only been in operation a couple of months, but there was this elderly Chinese lady who had been making dumplings, and she had something like 180 reviews, 5-star average. And the reviews were just glowing, and I could see the whole story. Like you kind of, I think a lot of the technology that's happened in food over the last 10 years has been sort of slowly sucking the soul out of the food, to the point where even if you look at the receipts on your deliveries, you'll see that like the delivery company has replaced the logo of the restaurant that's actually made the food for you. So we're getting increasingly disconnected from our food in some ways through these new services. And I felt Chef was going the opposite. And that was something that I was more aligned with than than what the other companies were doing. So they're bringing on new supply that you've never been able to purchase food from before, and they were showing that there was a lot of love for that. And despite this, they actually did not have a ton of investor interest. And so this was something I felt like I was recognizing from my experience in marketplaces that maybe other people weren't. I was willing to bet on that. Papa was similar, although I'd say maybe they looked a little bit more promising on paper. At the very least, there was already Honor who were in the market, who had shown that you could build a marketplace around delivering healthcare to people's homes. I think the challenge for Honor had just been this huge supply constraint issue. And that really made it very difficult for them to achieve escape velocity. And so when Andrew Parker's the CEO of Papa, came to me and explained his vision, again, sorry, I'll take a step back and explain Papa. So Papa is a marketplace. Their tagline is grandkids on demand, which isn't maybe as accurate today as it was when they're first starting, but essentially they pair medical students mostly with folks who are seniors who are aging in place. And their insight was, Honor showed us there are not enough medical professionals to really cover this sector. But what we've also seen in doing user interviews is that there's a lot of workflow that we can take care of without having a trained clinician visit the demand side of this platform. You know, there's actually issues around loneliness that insurance companies are really starting to pay attention to. The stat that you'll hear Papa talk about, what we've seen increasingly, is that loneliness actually might be worse for seniors than smoking a packet of cigarettes per day. And so being able to address this seemed, one, like it had the opportunity to bring this new supply on board, a signal that I obviously really care about. It's a supply where this kind of revenue is really meaningful for them. It's also accretive to what they're already doing. And the question was the demand side really going to jump on board, and could they convince insurance companies? But those signals were enough for me to get really interested at that point.
That's awesome. Those are really good examples, and thanks for sharing with us on that and a little bit more. So I've definitely I've kept my eye on Papa for quite some time now. So cool. So I don't think we could go group chat without mentioning the playbook that you shared before on fundraising. So I know many here have probably kind of gone into that in detail already. But are there maybe any kind of updates to that, kind of given the recent change in the fundraising environment that you'd like to share with us, maybe?
Well, it's funny because I actually only wrote it last September. I think it came out at the very end of September. And a lot of that was very much thanks to Lenny, who's a terrific editor and could kind of take some of my really long-winded musings and like carve them into something a little bit more digestible. So I felt like I was already taking in some of the context of COVID fundraising into account, and like I talked about them a little bit, but how you prepare your materials and how you create engagement with VCs certainly felt like it needed to be a little bit different in an environment where you were just so unlikely to actually meet them in person. And really, fundraising is a massive trust building exercise at Series A and beyond. You're trying to get someone to write you a $10 million plus check. There are people who, although now that's maybe changed again, where you have funds like Tiger who are willing to write like a $60 million check with like 2 days of diligence, no board seat afterwards. So even like late stage investing is starting to get, I think, a little bit looser, but it's still, for me, it's still a massive exercise in trust. And so what were other ways that you could create really dynamic ways to present yourself, your information, your company, your vision? And, some of the ideas have been like maybe creating looms of your product flows where you're narrating them and explaining some of the decisions you've made. And you can also like link this to certain data points that you're seeing in the product as well. Other elements might be, similar to what, say, what Rippling did when they were going to raise their Series B, is to really think about like a comprehensive set of materials and metrics similar to a data room, but maybe a little bit different. I mean, data rooms traditionally are kind of a little bit more boring and require funds to do a ton of digging and analysis. Everyone's sort of looking for a gotcha, whereas Rippling's approach was a much more self-narrated data room where, you know, a lot of it was visual with supporting text to explain that visual versus just, you know, a 5-year forecast, 2-year historicals, and a bunch of raw data, and now we'll let you go and parse that yourself. Rippling took the extra step to actually crunch that data, show their workings so that the funds could actually have like real conviction that that data had been done in the way that they would do it themselves. So there's a lot of things that you can do around that. I mean, I guess if anything's changed since then, it's even crazier today than it was at the end of last summer. I think it's easier today to raise on promise and vision than it certainly was 18 months ago. And I think if you are kind of aligning between should I go fundraise in September or should I fundraise now, you know, I would be thinking really long and hard about just going out right now versus waiting 3 to 4 months.
Awesome. That probably answered quite a few questions that we would have come up pretty soon. So I appreciate it. So I did want to ask, this just kind of came up, which, you know, what's the primary kind of difference that you've seen with fundraising, you know, in some of the primary kind of tech hubs in the US versus, you know, the European markets?
It happens a lot faster in the US typically. So first, like, I guess maybe let me like categorize how I see fundraising, because I think it gets distorted a little bit by what we read online. You know, every year I would say there's before COVID, there was a handful of companies who are lucky enough to have all these right data points, the right team, the right traction, the right vision, that, you know, there's a dozen or so funds trying to write them a blank term sheet. They can just call the shots and they have all the leverage. The vast majority of rounds like take a pretty considerable amount of time. They take 2 to 3 months, but you know, the last year has seen that accelerate quite intensely. You have some of the larger funds like Tiger, like Co2, who are willing to go earlier and earlier, who are willing to lead an investment without the same diligence, but it's not just diligence, it's almost conviction, as some of the other funds. I think partially because they're less tied into the legacy venture ecosystem. They're also less burdened by some of the inner noise from that ecosystem. You know, VCs rely very heavily on pattern recognition to make decisions. There's a ton of instinct that makes VCs either good or bad at what they do, and they sort of, there's also a lot of risk in each deal that they do. You know, an average partner at a fund will do maybe 2 to 3 investments a year, and they are left with those investments for a very long period of time. I remember a partner at Menlo saying, VC sounds great until you've been on the board of a company that is not progressing for a long period of time, and you have to show up at these board meetings every month or every quarter, but you feel like you don't have a lot of agency. There's not a lot that you can do. So because of this, VCs tend to come a lot back to consensus. They want to understand how other VCs might think about it, specifically those who might have some real subject matter expertise in an area that they're looking at. And that's not to say, like, don't take the wrong thing from that. I'm not saying that VCs are, you know, don't have their own opinions and need someone else's validation to make an investment. That's definitely not the case. There are moments when VCs can be contrarian, when they will literally fly in the face of all the feedback that they're getting from these. Quite a lot of energy and risk to be able to take that risk. And so sometimes, you know, it is helpful just to get some validation from other people. And certainly, like, as a seed investor, when you're investing across a lot of categories, it's essential, truthfully, to be able to make decisions as fast as you need to. So, like, I think because of some of this downward pressure, these VCs have had to change that approach a little bit. They've had to maybe get a little bit more on the front foot when making investment decisions. And I actually think it's been markedly different in the first quarter of 2021, even than like the middle, or say the third quarter of 2020, where everyone was talking about how crazy it was. I think Q1 of this year has been another level.
Awesome. That's really helpful. So we're going to jump in here to some questions here in a little bit. Otherwise, you and I could probably just go on talking for quite some time. But just given the that we're all earlier stage marketplace founders here, is there anything that you'd like to share with us? I didn't want to take up all the time myself asking questions.
Well, I'm happy to put that to the group here if there's specific stuff you guys want me to try and cover.
Awesome. Let's do it. So, hey, Sharik, did you want to jump on?
Hey, Mark.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good, Mark. Mark, pretty interesting. I love the fact that you worked with Airbnb and you've got this operator's experience, right? Which generally I don't tend to see when I'm talking to VCs or investors. So that's pretty interesting and amazing. And I like the idea that when you mentioned about having the supply side unique, because then the next question for me as a founder is, how does it then it becomes an experiential product, right? Your every experience at a different Airbnb home is going to be different. How does Airbnb look into that? Because you have to have a consistent experience, which is beyond expectations, better than what you're expecting as a customer. How do they manage it? That's a question, because the similar thing applies to my startup, which is CleverX. We are growing pretty fast, almost 62%. We have a very unique set of supply side. So we essentially connect professionals to high level, C-level executives in organizations, founders, investors on our platform over calls, projects, and surveys. And every time one customer speaks to the other professional on the other side of the platform, the experience is very different, right? You can talk about the same topic with 3 different people, but the experience is going to be different. How do you create that consistency? That's something that I'm really curious to understand.
Yeah, and that's so. Just to rephrase that, because I think there were a few things to unpack in there. You're talking about how do you create consistency around unique supply. And I think one thing is like important to understand maybe about the definition I was using for unique there. What I mean is supply that's hard to access, right, or that isn't available through another source. But I also understand, I think in this question, you mean where you have such varied supply that is non-standard. How do you create a consistent experience across that? So kind of 2 definitions of unique there. And it's a good question. Now, I think when it comes to Airbnb, unique supply was in our favor, in that we're competing against a fairly standardized product in accommodation, specifically hotels, that had different quality and price points, but from a product standpoint, it's a TV and a bed and ideally 4 dry walls and a roof over your head. And so, competing against that uniqueness actually was a virtue for us.
Okay.
One, it creates marketing collateral, right? Like, listen, there's, the treehouse that you see maybe advertised on the front page of Airbnb, it's so hard to book that, but it draws people in and it creates an image for them of, I might find something that's really different here, that's really exciting here. So in that way, I think we really leveraged unique supply. Like when we launched wish lists in 2012, or maybe it was early 2013, we featured a number of really exciting properties. I think there was 250 we sort of had in Airbnb's wish list around the world. And these were incredibly difficult properties to book, but it sort of was just this like leading point for people to create their own wish lists and find their own unique supply on the marketplace. So how do you solve this? I think rather than seek consistency, seek transparency. And, you know, reviews and ratings are sort of the obvious thing. But our goal at Airbnb was always to, I think, try and create the highest fidelity ability for a user to understand a listing that they possibly could. And it still takes way too long. Like really like good Airbnb guests who have used the platform a bunch of times know that they're going to get a really combined experience by reading the reviews. That if the reviews are good, expectations are so likely to be met that I can kind of maybe skim over some of the other details. But Airbnb listings have become way more detailed over time. I think our photography has leveled up on average over time quite considerably. In 2013, 2014, I'm still finding listings that had no photos. I don't even think it was till 2015 when we made it that you couldn't create a listing without photos.
Right.
Because obviously like host growth and, you know, having as little friction as in the way as possible was really important for us early on, but quality of supply became more important as we moved along. So I think focusing on transparency and making sure your demand side really understands what they're getting from your supply when there is that much variety is really important. You know, I've seen businesses like what you're doing with CleverX in the past. And one way to think about it is to really pick certain, you know, supportive wedges that you might try and focus on first versus going really wide with the type of expertise you have on the site. And that's both for a marketing standpoint, but also just for a market liquidity standpoint. So those are some things I can look at. I'm sure they're things that you're already doing, but that would be where I'd look first.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, you know, every time one user can have different experiences, I'm kind of worried about it. But you're right, it should be transparency rather than trying to make everything consistent, right? That shouldn't probably be the goal in the first place. Makes sense, yeah. Yeah, Mark, would love to have a chat with you whenever, I don't know if we can reach out to you over email. So I'll connect with Mike on this, get some, inputs on what we're working on. That would really be helpful if you get some time for us.
Sure. Nice to meet you.
Same here, Mark. Yeah.
Awesome. That was a really great question. So no, thanks for sharing more with us, Mark. So cool. So I think we're gonna call on, hey, Mark from Class Hub. Do you want to jump on?
I think I'm off now. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Hey, how are you? I'm Dublin based actually, so I think we're in the same neck of the woods.
We are being wired through America to each other in the same city.
Yes. So my marketplace is called Class Hub, and what we do is we connect private tutors with secondary school students and parents who require and are looking for lessons. So I'm just picking up on the point that you made, the difference, I suppose, between VCs over here in particularly in Ireland and Europe and in the US, and picking up on that kind of that they're much slower to make decisions.
Definitely
I've certainly found that. I've certainly found even on a more local sense within the Irish market, it's extremely difficult from a market to raise from a marketplace point of view. They're more interested in medical devices, life sciences. That's the sort of feedback I've been getting. But notwithstanding that, I'm in talks with a German company who's shown interest. I'm at seed stage, and I have 7 months of historicals. And what I wanted to really get, I suppose, maybe a bit of a flavor from you was the cohort analysis side of things. And maybe you could let me know what's an acceptable kind of, what are acceptable metrics there that they're looking for when they're looking at cohort analysis stats.
So
Generally with cohort analysis with marketplaces, let's take it back a step and say, we know that the initial problem is getting demand and supply to kind of meet at a semi-regular cadence. And so you're often trying to pick one side of the marketplace to focus on. One side that maybe needs the marketplace more or understands what this marketplace can do for it better than the other side that needs sort of maybe to be more convinced, right? So, you know, looking at Craigslist, it's really not hard to encourage someone to spin up a quick 10-second post to sell their bicycle, and they'll do it on the off chance that someone's going to ping them. But the demand side, you know, it's this sketchy platform, it's all in text, you know, maybe I get a couple of photos, but they're sort of weird photos. Like I have to hear almost that like lots of other people have used this before I might gain enough confidence to really put a ton of trust in it myself. So like in terms of like early metrics, I would say I want to see slightly better conversion over cohorts. So it's okay if your first supply cohort saw very few conversions. And interjected there for a second. I'm a fidgeter and my AirPods are like the object of that all the time. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. So it's okay if that supply hasn't really seen a ton of conversion. If they just stayed on, that's a pretty interesting signal that they really need this marketplace for one. If they are converting at higher intervals in secondary and third cohorts, this means that the demand has started to join them on the platform. So I think for marketplaces, you know, hitting 1 million ARR, right? These like benchmarks, they're far less established, and it becomes more about relative progress than about one specific number that you want to hit. Like I can't tell you specifically what retention or what additional conversion you might want to see across cohorts, simply that it is improving at a rate that is more than, you know, in like very small amounts. I think if you're showing like single digit percentage improvements in conversion, that's not quite enough for me to really feel convinced that demand has shifted a lot. Maybe the demand that you already had has just gotten a little bit more confident with the platform. But if you can show a pretty significant leap in conversion between say 2 or 3 cohorts, then I start to really think, okay, this is actually additional demand that is coming on the platform, and that's where these conversions are coming from.
Okay.
Obviously, other things I would look into beyond that, and that's sort of just like a hypothesis based on what we're talking about. But yeah, that would probably be what I looked at.
Great. Okay, well, look, it's thanks for that. Good to connect with you.
No problem.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Mark. Hey, Fitz, do you want to jump on?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for your time. So I'm working on a platform that connects institutional investors and hedge funds. And I wanted to go back to your discussion on the fundraising topic. So my question is, who is the best fundraiser you've come across, and what did they do differently?
Who is the best? I mean, like, I have to give it to Brian. I have seen Brian in front of a room of like really large institutional fund managers, like people, there was probably multiple trillions of dollars of capital under management in this room. And while getting like a number of data points completely wrong during this pitch, he just had them completely spellbound. So I think narrative and conviction are probably the 2 biggest traits that I've seen in really compelling fundraisers. I think another thing that they just judge really well is not trying to throw too many punches. So a weird analogy that I use sometimes is, I don't know if you're a boxing fan at all, but there's this really legendary fight back in the day, Muhammad Ali against George Foreman. Foreman beats the crap out of Ali for like 7 rounds, and Ali just kind of takes it, and then he throws one punch and George starts to go down, and there's this kind of moment where Ali's like pulling back to hit him again, and it's almost like he doesn't want to ruin the sweetness of this by spoiling it with like a somewhat misplaced punch. And I think you have to realize like when your points have landed and not like continue to like be verbose beyond that. So it shows clarity, right? And I think clarity is like one of the things that VCs instinctively seek for the most when they meet founders. 50% of pitches that you see, you sort of know you don't want to invest in. There's like 2% where you know you definitely want to invest in, and 48% sort of are like, you're not sure, right? If things go well, this could really work out. If things go poorly, it could be very tough. And someone who has like really great clarity on what are the most convincing points they have and delivers them in a narrative that brings them together, that makes them feel like organically built on top of each other. Those are the people I've seen been most successful. I mean, some others that I've seen, you know, who are particularly good at fundraising. Parker Conrad, obviously. I mean, he's like actually innovated around fundraising. He's now raised huge growth rounds for 2 companies in a row. Say what you want about him and, you know, what happened at the end with Zenefits. I think there's a lot of things that made that quite difficult, but he's shown himself to be like a real master. I think Justin Can sort of falls in this group as well. Just the few times I've seen him pitch, and, you know, he's pitched me, I've just been really compelled by how succinct he is and how clear he seems about his vision, and those things are interwoven together really well.
Great, thank you.
Awesome, cool. I can only imagine what it was like being in those meetings of Brian. So
yeah, really like intimidating if you have to go on next and talk about your tiny little feature off the back of this thing.
Yeah, I can imagine. So cool. Hey, Massimo, do you want to jump on?
Yes, thanks. And sorry, I'm late. We're in the middle of a fundraise as well, so this is quite relevant, but this is why I'm late as well. Mark, one question. So I'm in the middle of a fundraise. I've shared, it's a Series A, shared the data room with 5, 6, 7 funds, shared the teaser deck, they have access. My question now is, I know that now the power is in their hand. How do I keep leverage? How can I create a bit of competitive pressure here? I don't have the term sheet yet. I don't want to lie. I don't want to trick anyone into investing, but I want to create a bit of, I want to heat up the room a little bit. How would I do that?
Yeah, I feel for the position you're in, Massimo. It's sort of like this, you know, you go from a very hectic part of the process where you're pitching dozens and dozens of investors, and, you know, pretty much from the data room on, there's this eerie silence, and you still have all this like very intense energy from doing hundreds and hundreds of pitches, or however many pitches you did. And all of a sudden you go from very active to very passive mode. And it's very, every founder I've ever worked with has found this phase probably the most difficult of all the phases of the pitch, just because you are so passive. You know, truthfully, and just to make this answer like relevant to the whole group, the most important thing that you can do is ensure you have a really large set of initial outreach, a large target list for initial outreach, and making this 50 to 60 funds, I think, is fairly essential. Y Combinator sees in their data that their startups get on average 1 term sheet for every 30 funds that they first reach out to at Series A. So, you know, you're ideally you're playing a numbers game from the start, and this obviously filters its way all the way down this process where you're whittling away investors. I think another thing that's really important, just again at a high level, is this parallel process, right? That you don't really let one investor get too far ahead, and you don't, because this can create a scenario where potentially they're trying to cut your round off early and put you in a situation where you have a term sheet, and it doesn't even need to be an exploding term sheet. Term sheets do have, you know, usually a finite timeline to them for the most part. But in a situation where you have to decide between accepting that term sheet and rejecting all this unknown that's in front of you. So you want to avoid that situation as much as possible. And if you keep enough funds on this parallel process, ideally you end up in the point where you are, where it's still there's multiple conversations, and one flipping is where your leverage really changes. But what can you do maybe now, just focusing this answer now back on you, like what can you do maybe to spark some interest at this point? And it's without knowing like all the parts of your process, it's hard to give you like a really specific thing, but some things that have worked. One is like really trying to share new information that's coming to light with all the funds. Don't make your follow-up be just checking in. I think that's something that's going to make you feel more frustrated when you don't get a response afterwards, because for every email you send that they don't immediately respond to or respond to in a normal time, you get more stressed. And part of my job when I was trying to help founders fundraise is to try and manage their anxiety. Like this process is designed to manage that, because at least if there's a structure, you sort of know what to do next. So make the information that you're sending them relevant and additive to what you've been pitching them up to this point. Maybe there's a new study that's just come out. Maybe you've just signed up a new customer or a new logo. Maybe you've just hit a new milestone. Those are all data points that are absolutely relevant for your fundraising and could spur someone to make a decision or just to think of you. Another thing is to flip the diligence process. And this is a trick I really like, but they're doing diligence on you. You might reach out to them at this point and say like, hey, like I'd love if we could get to know each other a bit better. Things are really moving forward with this round, and I don't want to make a decision without getting to know some of these funds. Like maybe we could do and obviously right now this is difficult, but like an outdoor beer, and make it more of a social meeting and try and take some of the pressure of like, I'm doing this so that you can tell me like, are you going to invest or not? This is, like maybe we could just get a little bit of social time in between while you guys are doing your diligence and weighing this up. Each additional interaction is like adding a layer to this trust building process, right? And they maybe get to see a slightly different side of you. So that's another thing that I think you can do at this point. Aside from that, like what I definitely wouldn't do is, like you said, like pretending you have a term sheet or really getting too pushy. Sometimes the best things you can do at the self are just managing yourself at this point. And for some founders I've worked with, that's been like, maybe there's this like backup pool of investors that you want to start reaching out to just to make yourself feel like you're doing something productive. Or maybe this is a good time to just like dive back in on the operations of the business and put all of this stuff aside. What I can tell you is like pushing it is not going to be the difference between you raising or not. Like if you don't get a term sheet at this point, it's not going to be because you didn't like pressure the diligence phase as much as you can. However, once you do get any kind of indication that a term sheet is coming, it doesn't even have to be a term sheet itself. I think this can be a catalyst. You can say like, listen, I'm getting to the very last stages. I think I'm going to have to make a decision in the next week or so with one of the funds. I'd love to know where you guys are at. And, I don't want to pressure you into making a decision, but I also don't want to be in a situation where you guys have done all this work and you don't know what's happening with the process. So at a high level, I think like what I try to tell founders is like, you have to align everything you're saying and doing with the interests of the company. You're not doing this because you're stressed. You're not doing this because you need an answer. You're doing this because like the business is trying to run a process. You're trying to mediate that on behalf of the business. And I find if you like put yourself in that mindset, you're less likely to do the things that sometimes VCs can interpret as being more desperate, right? They might interpret like being too pushy as, well, you're not hearing yes anywhere else. So sometimes just being silent can actually be better for you.
Yeah. Okay. That's amazing. Thank you so much. And then just to double click quickly on what you said before in terms of running that parallel process. So what we've decided to do is to run 2 cohorts. One cohort the first week and one that would start the second week, just because we wanted to preempt potential term sheets that from funds that take a bit of a longer times, funds that aren't used to moving so fast. Obviously, in the environment we're seeing today, a lot of funds can move very quickly, but some of the ones we want to work with don't really do that. So what are your views on that? Do you think that's okay in terms of that overlap by a week or so? Like,
oh yeah, if it's
that's not a deal breaker.
By a week, it's not. I mean, to be honest, if you're going to have 40 or 50 funds at the very top of your funnel, that's going to take 2 to 3 weeks to clear through all the first meetings. Well, certainly in the in-person days when you're trying to get maybe across the city from one fund's office to the other. But even, to be honest, like, at the moment I'm raising a fund, I'm probably doing 7 LP pitches a day over the busiest period of that. And it's been really unique to get that insight into having to do the fundraise myself. And I find that exhausting, truthfully. Like, I don't know if I always have the right energy at the 7th pitch of the day. So anyway, the more to say is that like a 3-week period for your first meetings is not unusual, or 2.5, 3 weeks. So to break things up like this by cohort makes sense. What I would just struggle with there is like trying to guess in advance, like who belongs in cohort 1 or 2, but I'm sure you had some logic around that.
Yeah, no, makes complete sense. Thanks a lot, Mark.
No problem.
Awesome. Glad you could jump on, Massimo. So,
yeah, I mean, like, super useful. Again, amount of good content here was really good.
Yeah, awesome, cool. Thanks for sharing more with us, Mark, on that. So we're almost out of time here, so definitely want to be conscious of that. But before we kind of wrap things up, I know you and I were kind of having a brief chat prior to starting the recording. What's one maybe kind of memorable experience or story you can share with us?
Oh, or like from the Airbnb days. I mean, there's like a lot. I don't know, like what probably comes to mind the most. Like, it's kind of hard because I'm like thinking about funny, silly things that might not really have like any value to the group outside of entertainment. Yeah. And some things that were like pretty deep and maybe scary as well. Like anything in particular, maybe like based on some other chats you guys have been having over the last few weeks and months?
I just try to get some interesting stories, so we can get to know our group chat guests. So I do have a question though. So maybe we'll kind of steer it this way. Since some of us have visited the Airbnb office, what's your favorite room there?
Oh, wow. Great question. Paris, definitely Paris. And actually, it's really cool. If you've been to 888, I'm guessing not the older offices, but the Paris office in 888, the wallpaper is actually designed by an Irish artist. And we actually got in quite a bit of hot water when she found out her wallpaper was in our office, and I had a connection to her through someone, and I ended up having to try and like mediate and sort of like tell her like we weren't like trying to sell her wallpaper without her knowledge or do anything like that. We just thought it was beautiful and it matched the design of this listing we had in Paris. So some of the weird and wacky ways Airbnb led me down these strange wormholes, I guess.
That's awesome. So I actually haven't had a chance to visit that one. So my favorite was the donut room. So that was a good one.
So that is Paris. The donut with the little plastic donuts. That's the Paris room. That's also my favorite.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's a listing in Paris that it was based off of. So
got it. What a coincidence. Well, awesome. Well, this is a really great chat and also a fun one for sure. So thanks again for taking the time to join us and share more on your experience and insights, and then answering some questions from the group here. So we appreciate it. Right before we do wrap though, where can we keep up with you? Time for a kind of quick little plug.
So you can follow me on McCabe, at McCabe on Twitter. And, I like try to check in the DMs as much as possible. I might be like a little bit slower. If it's something like pretty acute, like please feel free to go through Mike. Mike has all my contact details. Otherwise, I'd say don't try and reach me on LinkedIn. That's maybe the worst way to try and get in touch with me.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate it. Thanks again for taking the time to join us today. So this is a good one. And thanks everyone for the great questions too.